We are recording. Okay, so welcome to our presentation on the Woodcock Johnson with Issa Romance and Christina Bradley and myself, Julie. So we are going to start by talking. So the Woodcock Johnson actually has 3 tests, and there's a cognitive test, an oral language test, and a test of achievement. So like a speech pathologist might give the oral language test, a sped teacher, or we could also give the achievement test, but for this class, we're going to be talking about the cognitive abilities test. And this test can be for ages from 2 to 80 plus. So a little more flexibility as far as ages goes compared to the WISC. Norms.
Yeah, and so before we get into the subtests, just to give you an idea of what the norms look like, the norms that this test is based on were established through a 3-year study that ended in January of 2012, so quite a few years ago. The participants in this study were randomly selected using census information, and then the other factors were controlled for, like sex, race, and ethnicity. So if this sounds familiar, you'd see that the shortcomings of the WISC in terms of where they get their norms also apply to the Woodcock-Johnson.
So for the Woodcock-Johnson, there are a lot of different options for what you give. You can give, there's a standard battery of 10 subtests. There's also an extended battery. Or you can just give the first 7 to find the GIA, the General Intelligence, what does it stand for? The General Intelligence Ability, which is basically the WISC's version of IQ. And for the sake of time and our presentation and our limited resources, we're just going to talk about the first 7 subtests, because the first 7 subtests can actually be broken down where some of the subtests have multiple subtests within the subtests. So for example, like phonological processing, that whole subject is broken down into 3 different subtests. So it's still quite intense, and that we're just going to dive into these 7 for the sake of time.
Perfect. And then, kind of to touch on what Julie mentioned, like she said, a lot of the different subtests have subtests within them, and oral vocabulary is just one of those examples. So there are 2 subtests for oral vocabulary. There's synonyms and antonyms. And basically for this subtest, the examinee is basically required to listen to a word for synonyms, for example, and then provide a word with the same or similar meaning, and then the opposite for antonyms, so the word with an opposite meaning. For this particular subtest, it's really looking at abilities related to an examinee's language development, their vocabulary, their listening comprehension, oral expression, and there are elements of phonological awareness in there as well. And then this particular subtest segment is also looking at the speed of lexical access, which we looked up to learn more about, and basically looking at how an individual is able to assess words in their own mental vocabulary when doing this particular subtest. And then we have some examples to follow. So you guys can see some of the sample items in the next slide here from that oral vocabulary section. So for example, you would say something like point to nap and say, tell me another word for nap. And so that's one example. And then the other example we put in there is just for antonyms. So we jump to this second example there. It would be point to up and say, tell me the opposite of up. So those are just 2 quick examples of what that subtest looks like. And then another subtest that we looked into is called number series. And so basically in this subtest, students are given a series of numbers, and there's one number that's missing within that series. And the student's objective in this particular subtest is to find that missing number. So this subtest for number series is really looking at measuring executive functioning, especially as it relates to cognitive flexibility. So how can the student or examinee change their strategies in order to find that missing number? And then we're also looking, of course, at working memory. So are they able to hold information while actively seeking an answer to that missing sequence? And then we have an example here that you guys can take a look at for more information. So for this one, it just says, point to sample A on the subject's page and say, look at these numbers and tell me the number that belongs in the empty box. And then we have an example below.
So the next subtest would be verbal attention. Verbal attention looks at short-term memory and attentional control skills. So how this one works is the student is presented with an audio recording of some sort of combined list of either animals or numbers. So what that would look like is they would hear a recording that says cat 4, and then they would be asked what was the animal. So yeah. And then on the next slide, you can see an example of the sample page from this test. So like I said, it would say, look at, sorry, it's hard to read. It would say like kitten 4, tell me the number. And then it would say 4.
So the next one is letter pattern matching, and it is very similar, as you can see on the right, it's very similar to symbol search from the WISC. You have to scan across, and you have a 3-minute time limit, and you have your record book, and the student has to scan across and identify the 2 common letter patterns. So these are letter patterns like O, the letter O, or V, or as you see in the picture, as it goes down, it gets a little more elaborate. So like PL, pull, or TH. They have to scan through visually and identify the common letter patterns in a 3-minute time limit. And this assesses your processing speed and measures cognitive efficiency. For phonological processing, this subject is broken down into 3 different subtests. There's word access, word fluency, and substitution. So for word access, the student names a word. This tester would name a specific sound, a specific phonemic element. For example, like B, and we would say, tell me a word that starts with B, and they would say any word, boy, big, in the example, like you can see, and that would be correct. For word fluency, the student has to name as many words as possible that begin with a specific sound in 1 minute. So I might say, name a word, name as many words as you can that start with the sound k, and as long as it starts with k, it's correct, and as many as possible in 1 minute, so it's timed. And then substitution, you would ask them to substitute a part of the word, and then ask them what the new word is. So the example here is replace, in the word sunny, change sun to pen. What would the word be? And the word would be penny.
The next subtest that we looked at is called story recall. So for this particular subtest, the student or the examinee is basically presented with increasingly more complex stories via an audio recording. After the student or examinee listens to the story, they're basically asked to recall as many details as they can about the stories, again, as they increase in complexity. This subtest is really looking at measuring, meaningful memory. So basically a person's ability to retain long-term retrieval information, and then also language processing development as well.
So visualization is the last subtest that goes into the GIA, and this test is made up of 2 different tasks. The first one is spatial relations, and so in this task, the student must identify 2 to 3 pieces to form a complete target shape. And in block rotation, which may sound similar, student must identify 2 block patterns that match a target pattern. So these 2 tests are really looking at an individual's visual spatial skills. And so block rotation might sound similar to block design and the WISC. It is a little bit different. If you go to the next slide, you can see that this is a two-dimensional test. So rather than having physical blocks that you have to manipulate, like in block design, in this test, you look at the different options on a sheet of paper and have to select two that match the original shape. So like in this example, B and R would be the correct response for this question.
So we are all done talking about the 7 subtests, and we just want to talk a little more about the test itself. So in this test, you do not find a full-scale IQ. You do find a GIA, the General Intelligence Ability, from the first 7 subtests, and the GIA is described as the like overall performance on the test. And it predicts your overall achievement in like your cognitive ability. Very similar to the IQ, it does not predict adaptive skills, but it does predict, cognitive skills. And the individual subtests are better at predicting how well you would do in a specific academic subject, whereas like the overall GAA does not necessarily predict how you will do in like math or science. So the scoring is the same as the WISC. It's scored based on age norms, and as you can see in the bell curve, it starts with anything 70 or lower is extremely low or very low, and then it ranges all the way to superior. You can see the breakdown in the curve. It's very similar to the WISC. And we do want to talk a little bit about just some comparisons between the WISC and the Woodcock-Johnson. So some pros of having it calculate the GIA rather than the IQ is just getting rid of the words IQ. Kind of takes a big weight, I think, off of a lot of people know, IQ carries a large weight, and it has this big reputation to be all, if my child is smart or not because they have a high IQ. And we know that it's so biased and it really just means nothing. But just removing the words IQ from the results and putting in something else, it gives the practitioner more opportunity to explain what the test results really mean, because parents are less likely to have their own preconceived notion, which I think is, we all think is a pretty big con of not finding an IQ. And then, a pro of not finding an IQ. And a con would be that parents might want to find the IQ. They might give some pushback, and there's also, unfamiliarity. So it can, it comes with the good and the bad. A good practitioner can take this opportunity to be a way to educate parents, but it's more work because you have to explain what it means rather than them kind of coming in knowing, I know what an IQ is.
Yeah, and then from the, pros and cons of the audio recording. So that's, I think, one of the biggest distinguishers between the administration of the WISC and the Woodcock-Johnson is you have these like pre-recorded audio sessions that the examinee has to listen to. So on the positive side of that, like there's potentially less risk for administrator error, less risk for biases when it comes to just having to listen to a standardized recording as opposed to someone's voice. So that was one of the pros that we saw. And then the cons, in terms of that, it's less personable. So if you think about an audio recording, like that might seem very foreign to a student who's taking the Woodcock-Johnson. You've spent all this time as the school psychologist or special ed director or teacher, taking the time to build rapport with the student before you administer ideally any of these assessments. And the fact that they have to listen to a recording could definitely leave room for just that level of uncomfortability in that setting.
Yeah, and just some other general tidbits about the comparisons between the WISC and the Woodcock-Johnson. This does have more subtests. So there are 17 total. Like we said earlier, only 7 of them do pull into the GIA. But because there are 17 total subtests, there is more opportunity to get more information about how a student learns than there would be with the number of subtests that are on the WISC. And there's also a much larger age range on the WISC that we showed earlier.
For the Woodcock Johnson.
For the Woodcock Johnson. Thank you. It's ages 2 to 80 plus years compared to the WISC that is 6 to 16.
And then I think one of the last cons that we talked about was just, I'm sorry, in terms of the norming, just the fact that the norming sample is from January 2012. So, 8 years ago, and a lot's changed since then. So how do we keep these types of assessments up to date and consistent with norms that are representative of the populations that are actually taking these assessments? So that was one of the cons that we saw.
Cool. Are you ready?
Yes. And then just as a resource for you guys, so this is a 50-minute, so in your spare time, in-depth video by one of the co-authors of the Woodcock Johnson, Frederick, I don't want to mispronounce his last name, so I'll leave that for interpretation. But it's really interesting. He kind of goes into, the 3 different Woodcock Johnson tests, like we talked about at the beginning. So the cognitive test, the achievement test, and then the oral test as well. And so it's just a oral language test. So it's a really interesting way to get a thorough understanding of the Woodcock Johnson.
And these are just our sources. All right. Hope you enjoyed it.
Thanks, guys.
Okay, stop recording.